Hi everyone. This is the second of two videos addressing the topic of reading comprehension. This second video focuses on informational or expository text. Our last video focused on narrative text, and although much of what we'll be talking about in this video is similar to that which we talked about in the previous video, there are some differences between teaching comprehension of narrative and teaching comprehension of informational text. I'll be drawing on the chapter in the Best Practices book by Nell Duke and Nicole Martin. These authors acknowledge that there is much that goes into reading comprehension and reading comprehension performance, not the least of which are student characteristics. How well does the student decode? How fluent is the student's decoding? What is the nature of the student's vocabulary knowledge? What is the nature of the student's overall knowledge of the content that they're reading? And all of these factors, of course, influence reading comprehension, which makes it the more complex of those two components, decoding and comprehension. And again, whereas decoding is a more step-by-step, skill-based process, comprehension is much more recursive. The same kinds of thinking that goes on in prediction for a kindergartner is very similar to prediction of a college student. However, it becomes more sophisticated, more nuanced, more differentiated, and the texts about which they are predicting become incredibly more difficult. So the same kinds of strategies, the wheel just keeps turning, but it just keeps getting better and better and better with more challenging texts. Very different kind of process involved in becoming a strategic comprehender than in becoming a more automatic decoder. So the notion of teaching strategic reading is integral to understanding both narrative and informational texts. And this should look very familiar to you, both from Tavani's book, I Read It, But I Don't Get It. And I can't emphasize enough for those of you who are struggling to teach comprehension, go back and look at that book because there is so much practical information that she provides. But strategies should be thought of as a set of strategies. We want kids to be able to move flexibly between strategies, but for kids who are challenged by comprehension, those strategies most likely need to be taught singularly and then combined. So what are those strategies? Well, they just keep coming up over and over and over again. As Tavani began her book, setting a purpose for reading. What is my goal? Do I need to read the whole text or just part of it? Do I need to study it or do I need to search for information? Connecting to prior knowledge. Activating, another way of saying that, activating background knowledge. Have I read or learned about this before? What have other authors or people said about it? What in my own experience do I know about this topic? Predicting. Prediction is a good strategy, particularly for narrative content. What do I think will happen next from my own experience? Or in the case of informational text, it's more what will I learn about next? Some people say that inference making is the essence of comprehension. So inferencing means that you quote unquote have to read between the lines. So for this to make sense, what needs to be true, for example, or what has the author left out that might be important? Unique to informational or expository texts typically are graphs and figures, and being able to interpret those and read those is very important for understanding the content. Somewhat unique, I think, also to informational text is this idea of, do I agree or disagree with what is being presented and why? Both narrative and expository text demand that we monitor our comprehension. When is it that we are confused, and what kinds of fix-up strategies are we going to engage in? That we question the text. In other words, why is this true? What does that mean? Even what does it remind me of? Is it consistent with something I've already learned or I have not learned? Or what does this word mean? As simple as a vocabulary word. And then summarizing, what has the author said so far? What has happened in a narrative text? What has happened so far? What did I learn in this paragraph? Questions that are more, what did I learn and what has the author said so far, tend to be more specific to informational texts. But again, the idea is teaching students to be strategic readers. Some principles. The notion of authentic text. In other words, we talked about this in the last video, that you want to read real books. You can teach a strategy using a paragraph, but even a paragraph, it's useful if it comes maybe from a newsletter or a newspaper or a magazine article, not something that is made up just for a reading task. This particular chapter takes it even one step further and suggests creating writing. In this particular case, they're talking about students creating a brochure for a nature center. You might say creating a newsletter for, say, an exercise program. Or what my grandson did was having to write for Career Day. In other words, he picked his career, which just happened to be a South Park animator. Don't ask. And what it would entail to become an animator, what it means to be an animator, and what you do on a daily basis. That's authentic reading and writing. John Guthrie, who is most noted for motivation, how do you motivate kids to read and write more, has developed concept-oriented reading instruction. And for this, it's really organized around a specific content. What they talk about in the chapter is that students developed expertise in scientific content, and the title of their document was Survival of Life on Land and Water. So the idea of being really interested in a topic, and we have kids in the clinic who are interested in specific topics, using that then for reading and writing purposes, authentic purposes. The other is the idea of science ideas, which is another model where students work to solve problems and develop scientific expertise. Strategies have to be practiced over and over again until they become almost automatic, but never, of course, automatic, because the text shifts all the time. But what also shifts is this responsibility for strategy use from the teacher to the student. So the student over time becomes more and more responsible for implementation of the strategy and the decision about which strategy to use. Now, what happens with what is a little bit different with informational text is this notion of engaging students in text structure. So specific text structure instruction. On the last set of slides, we talked about story structure and story elements. That stories have typically characters, a setting, a problem and a solution, or a beginning, middle, and end, or a sequence of events. With informational text, there are a variety of text structures. And so let's just, first of all, look at how narrative and informational generally differ. So the purpose of a narrative text is to entertain, of an expository text or a content area text is to inform. Narrative text is typically familiar. It's life-based. Informational text, by definition, is providing you with unfamiliar content. It's informing you. It's based on factual information. Narratives are based on character motivation, intentions, and goals. There's a little bit of difference in vocabulary. Narrative texts include academic vocabulary, but it's generally Tier 2. Expository texts include Tier 2 and those very specific academic content words of Tier 3. We'll talk about signal words, not so critical in narrative, but very helpful in informational text. Simple text structures, story elements can be reflected pretty simply in those story maps. More complex text structures which shift within chapters and across different content areas. Narrative texts typically can stand alone. You may want to follow a particular author, for example. They may have a character that goes from one story to another. But informational texts, you have to integrate the information across text. And it's part of the reason why they teach, they circle the content in the Common Core state standards. And consequently, although I talked about strategies being consistent and across, there are a few that are a little bit different. Connect to prior knowledge means connecting to experience in narrative text, but to content in informational text. Predicting in narrative text typically works very well. Predicting in informational text, you have to tweak it a little bit because the content is going to be new. I wouldn't expect someone to predict the content. You might be able to predict, however, the nature of the content that the author is going to tackle next by looking at the headings. So a nice strategy is to take a heading and turn it into a question. Informational is pragmatic versus logical. Not so many illustrations, although there still are some in informational text, but there are definitely maps, charts, and graphs. And then the last three are relatively similar. But there are these kind of subtle differences between narrative and expository texts overall. As I mentioned, the text structure in narrative text is pretty consistent, and as I said, can be reflected in simple or more complex story maps. There are characters, there is a setting or different settings, there are a series of events. However, informational texts can be organized in a variety of ways, and these are probably the four most common. Cause and effect. I observed in a high school 10th grade world history class, and the entire 90-minute session was organized around the vocabulary word appeasement and the appeasement policy. The causes of the appeasement policy, American and European in regard to Germany before World War II, and the effects of the appeasement policy resulting somewhat in World War II. You can certainly, in social studies, this is a compare and contrast democracy with dictatorship. You can also do it, it's integral really to the scientific method and to science experiments. Compare what happens before and after a certain intervening variable is introduced. My personal favorite, which are timelines. I love timelines. I love sort of history, I think, and seeing this sequence of historical events, so a sequence, and then problem solution. Again, a part of history, social science, and certainly integral to the scientific method. But these are four different text structures. And it's not as though social studies has cause and effect. It's not as though biology has compare and contrast at all. These text structures, this way of organizing information and organizing arguments, appears within all of the content areas. But it's a helpful structure to teach students, just like story structure is helpful in understanding narrative text. And there are these signal words which occur when you have a compare and contrast text structure, cause and effect text structure, and this may just be one or two sentences, but you can realize what I'm reading about is a cause and then an effect. A sequence, again, may be situated in one paragraph or an entire chapter, and then problem solution. So some signal words to help kids realize, okay, this is what the author is trying to convey to me. They're trying to convey that there was a cause and there was an effect, or the author is conveying to me a sequence of events, and signal words will signal that to the reader if they are aware of them. In addition to signal words, visual aids are consistently thought of as a best practice in informational text instruction. Over and over and over again in research studies, they've found a positive effect for graphic organizers. And that's because they really take our thinking and the author's purpose and make it more concrete, provide more structure to it, provide an additional visual cue, which is organized. And you can think of this as visualization. I know a number of you are doing visualization as a comprehension strategy in the clinic this semester. By really studying the visuals that the author provides, the tables and the figures and the graphs, and finally by creating and or completing graphic organizers. And I've introduced you before to Building Academic Vocabulary by Marzano, but in this teacher's guide, teacher resource, there are also many graphic organizers which depict these different text structures. And so here's a cause and effect. You know, what are the different causes leading up to the Civil War? 1, 2, and 3. Compare and contrast, you know. Should the United States launched missiles against Syria? Pro and con reasons. And then finally, of course, sequence of events and that appeasement theory, the appeasement policy, they're listed as an effect of the appeasement policy. The teacher listed as sequence of events that led up to Poland, the Germans invading Poland in 1939. So cause and effect is one example. There are many of these. Compare and contrast, sequence of events, and finally problem solution. So as an example, the preschool lab here on campus needs to refurbish its playground. That's the problem. What might be the solution? Well, the solution might be a fundraiser. And that leads to a second problem. So how do we organize a fundraiser? And that leads to another solution and so on. And maybe this is the subject of the preschool's newsletter for this month. So a variety of different text structures which can be very useful in helping kids understand informational text. So there are the strategies we've been talking about all semester from I Read It But I Don't Get It, Chris Tavani's really good book, which I encourage you to go back and read and reread. The strategies that we talked about in the last set of slides that were introduced to you in terms of narrative text, reciprocal teaching being one of them. The need to use text and teach explicitly text structure. A second important principle of good information text instruction. And third, use visual aids, and in particular, graphic organizers. So just to kind of give you an idea of how this may sort of come together, here are two sentences from a content area text. Organized labor was a critical element of the New Deal coalition. As a result of the Wagner Act and other pro-labor legislation passed during the New Deal, union members enjoyed better working conditions and increased bargaining power. Only two sentences. There are some signal words there as a result of, signaling a cause and effect relationship. But these two sentences are dense, relatively dense, what we call lexical density. First of all, the second sentence is quite long, and nearly half of the words in these two sentences are content words. So they assume vocabulary knowledge. And third, there are references to previous texts. So remember, connections to self, connections to the world, connections to other text. Other pro-labor legislation requires, you only need one R there really, connections to other text. So that's an example of kind of pulling together multiple strategies, multiple ideas. Didn't really use a graphic organizer here, but in order to understand informational text. So it's a brief slide, or brief group of slides this week, and this is your third and final response question. A fourth grade student you're working with is able to decode fluently but has considerable difficulty answering comprehension questions following short narrative and expository passages. So what I want you to do is to decide to focus on comprehension of either narrative or expository text. That's your first decision. Based on that decision, develop an instructional plan, including a focus goal, one goal, and exemplary activities. And I want you then to use that goal with supporting activities to explicitly and systematically support your student in becoming a more strategic reader. Have fun with that.